La Noche Triste, the night courtier, almost lost Mexico. The gathering storm, in the humid darkness of a June night in 1520, as storm clouds gathered over Lake Texcoco and lightning flickered in the distance like the angry breath of gods, Hernán Cortés stood on the flat roof of Axayacatal's palace and stared into an abyss of his own making. For 8 months, his audacious gamble to control the Aztec Empire from within had teetered between brilliant success and catastrophic failure. Now, as the sound of war drums echoed across the water, and tens of thousands of Aztec warriors surrounded his makeshift fortress, the conquistador faced the stark reality that his conquest of Mexico hung by a thread so thin it might snap with the next gust of wind. The palace that had once served as luxurious quarters for Spanish guests had been transformed into a desperate stronghold where 400 European soldiers, 6,000 indigenous allies, and countless camp followers huddled in fear, while outside their walls, the greatest city in the Americas burned with revolutionary fury. The courtyards that had once echoed with diplomatic conversations now rang with the sounds of weapons being sharpened and prayers being muttered in a dozen different languages as men prepared for what might be their final battle. Cortés himself bore little resemblance to the confident Captain General who had first marched into Tenochtitlan 8 months earlier, his armor gleaming and his banners flying. The man who now surveyed the hostile city spreading in all directions was hollow-eyed from sleepless nights, his face etched with lines of stress and calculation as he weighed options that all seemed to lead toward disaster. His graying beard was unkempt, his once immaculate clothing stained with sweat and blood, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the stone balustrade that separated him from a drop into the palace courtyard below. The sequence of events that had led to this desperate situation began with what should have been a moment of triumph: the capture of Moctezuma and the apparent submission of the Aztec Empire had seemed to validate Cortés's most ambitious strategies, while providing the Spanish crown with the richest prize in the known world. For months, the emperor had remained a compliant prisoner, whose orders were obeyed throughout the empire, while Spanish soldiers systematically looted the treasure chambers that contained the accumulated wealth of generations. But the very success of this psychological warfare had sown the seeds of its own destruction. The arrest of a divine ruler whose word had been law for nearly 2 decades created a constitutional crisis that undermined the entire foundation of Aztec political authority. The nobles who had once competed to demonstrate their loyalty to Moctezuma began to question whether a captive emperor retained the divine favor necessary for legitimate rule. The priests who had validated imperial authority through religious ceremonies found themselves confronting theological questions about the relationship between earthly power and cosmic order that had no precedent in their accumulated wisdom. The crisis that transformed smoldering resentment to open rebellion came from an act of stunning brutality that violated every principle of diplomatic immunity and religious sanctuary that governed civilized conduct in Mesoamerica. Pedro de Alvarado, the hot-tempered lieutenant whom Cortés had left in command while dealing with a rival Spanish expedition on the coast, had interpreted the elaborate preparations for the festival of Toxcatl as evidence of planned treachery rather than religious observance. The massacre that followed would be remembered by the Aztecs as one of the most heinous crimes in their history: the unprovoked slaughter of hundreds of unarmed nobles who had gathered in the Templo Mayor's sacred courtyard to honor their gods through traditional dances and ceremony. Alvarado's soldiers had surrounded the temple complex under cover of darkness, sealing every exit before opening fire on participants who wore their finest feathers and most precious ornaments, while performing rituals that dated back to the founding of their civilization. The blood that flowed across the temple's stone pavement that morning had washed away any possibility of peaceful coexistence between Spanish and Aztec culture. The survivors who escaped the massacre carried news of Spanish treachery throughout the city, igniting a popular uprising that transformed Tenochtitlan from a reluctant host to an implacable enemy determined to drive the foreign invaders into the lake or die in the attempt. Now, as Cortés listened to the war cries that rose from every quarter of the city, he understood that he faced a situation that his previous experience in the Caribbean had never prepared him to handle. This was not a conventional military engagement between organized armies with clear objectives and established rules of conduct, but a popular revolution fueled by religious outrage and nationalistic fervor that recognized no boundaries between combatants and civilians, sacred and secular or acceptable and unacceptable methods of warfare. The emperor, who might have served as a bridge between the warring cultures, lay dying in his chambers, struck down by stones thrown by his own subjects, who no longer recognized his authority to speak for their interest. The indigenous allies who had provided crucial support for Spanish operations throughout central Mexico were trapped alongside their European partners, their loyalty transformed into a liability that made them targets for Aztec vengeance. As the first heavy raindrops began to fall from the storm clouds gathering overhead, Cortés realized that the night ahead would determine not merely the fate of his expedition, but the entire future of European expansion in the Americas. Success might lead to the conquest of the richest empire in the New World, while failure would mean the destruction of Spanish forces and the likely end of European attempts to penetrate the Mexican mainland for generations to come. The trap springs shut. The transformation of Tenochtitlan from a magnificent host city to a deadly trap had occurred with stunning rapidity, catching even experienced Spanish officers off guard with the speed and coordination of Aztec military preparation. Within hours of news of the temple massacre spreading through the city's neighborhoods, every causeway leading to the mainland had been cut, every bridge destroyed, and every canoe harbor fortified with barriers that could be defended by relatively small numbers of warriors against vastly superior attacking forces. Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother and the de facto leader of Aztec resistance, had demonstrated strategic brilliance that revealed the sophisticated military planning capabilities that had made the empire the dominant power in Mesoamerica. Unlike his predecessor, who had attempted to manage the Spanish presence through diplomacy and accommodation, this seasoned warrior understood that the conflict had moved beyond negotiation to a struggle for survival that would be determined by military effectiveness rather than political maneuver. The siege tactics that Cuitlahuac employed against the Spanish stronghold represented a masterful adaptation of traditional Mesoamerican warfare to the unique challenges posed by European military technology and urban combat conditions. Rather than attempting costly frontal assaults against Spanish positions that were protected by superior weapons and defensive advantages, the Aztec commander implemented a strategy of gradual strangulation that would slowly drain enemy resources while minimizing his own casualty. The water supply that had served the palace complex was cut off within the first day of the siege, forcing Spanish forces to rely on rainwater collection and carefully rationed reserves, while their enemies enjoyed unlimited access to the lake and the freshwater aqueducts that served other parts of the city. Food deliveries that had previously arrived daily from markets throughout the empire ceased completely, compelling the besieged garrison to consume their emergency supplies while watching their strength slowly ebb away. The psychological warfare that accompanied these physical hardships demonstrated Cuitlahuac's understanding of European weaknesses and cultural blind spots that could be exploited for strategic advantage. The continuous sound of war drums that echoed day and night throughout the city created an atmosphere of constant tension that prevented Spanish soldiers from obtaining the rest necessary for maintaining combat effectiveness. The ritual chanting and religious ceremonies that were conducted within sight of Spanish positions reminded the invaders of their isolation within a hostile culture that regarded them as cosmic pollutants, whose very presence threatened universal order. The treatment of Spanish prisoners that were captured during skirmishes around the palace perimeter provided horrifying examples of what awaited any Europeans who fell into Aztec hands alive. These unfortunates
were subjected to elaborate torture rituals that were designed not merely to extract information but to demonstrate Spanish vulnerability while terrorizing their companions who were forced to witness the proceedings from the palace wall. The network of tunnels and underground passages that connected different parts of the city enabled Aztec warriors to move undetected while positioning themselves for surprise attacks against Spanish patrol routes and supply lines. These subterranean pathways, originally constructed as part of the city's drainage and water management systems, had been converted into a military asset that provided enormous tactical advantages to defenders who possessed detailed knowledge of their layout and capability. The war canoes that controlled Lake Texcoco's surface transformed the city's aquatic environment into another dimension of the siege, preventing any Spanish attempt to escape by water while enabling Aztec forces to maintain communication and coordination between different parts of their defensive network. The skilled canoe crews who manned these vessels represented the elite of Aztec naval forces, warriors who could navigate the lake's complex currents and shallow areas while engaging in hit-and-run attacks that harassed Spanish positions without exposing themselves to sustained counterattack. The civilian population that had initially appeared neutral or even supportive of Spanish presence revealed itself as another component of Aztec military strategy, when ordinary citizens began participating in siege activities by constructing defense, carrying supplies to military positions, and providing intelligence about Spanish movements and capability. This total mobilization of urban resources created a situation where every individual within the city represented a potential threat while eliminating the distinction between combatants and non-combatants that European warfare traditionally recognized. The propaganda campaign that accompanied military operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and its role in maintaining civilian morale while undermining enemy confidence. Aztec leaders spread stories of Spanish vulnerability and divine abandonment while emphasizing their own determination to fight to the death rather than submit to foreign domination. These narratives helped sustain popular support for resistance activities while encouraging individuals to make personal sacrifices for collective survival. The intelligence network that provided Aztec commanders with detailed information about Spanish strengths, weakness, and intended movements relied upon the cooperation of palace servants, market vendors, and other individuals who had daily contact with European forces, while maintaining loyalty to indigenous leadership. This espionage system enabled Cuitlahuac to anticipate Spanish actions while positioning his forces for maximum effectiveness during confrontations that might otherwise have favored technologically superior enemies. The coordination mechanisms that synchronized military activities throughout the sprawling urban complex required communication systems and command structures that could function despite the physical barriers created by canals, causeways, and architectural obstacles that divided the city into semi-independent sectors. The use of smoke signals, drum codes, and messenger networks enabled centralized strategic planning while maintaining tactical flexibility that allowed local commanders to respond rapidly to changing circumstances.
The point of no return. As night fell on June 30, the Spanish position within Axayacatl's palace had deteriorated to the point where Cortés faced the stark choice between attempting a desperate escape or remaining trapped until starvation and disease completed the destruction that Aztec weapons had begun. The casualties suffered during 8 months of siege warfare had reduced his effective fighting strength to fewer than 400 Europeans, while disease, combat losses, and desertion had eliminated most of the indigenous allies who had provided crucial support throughout the Conquest campaign. The treasure that had originally justified Spanish participation in the enterprise had become a psychological and logistical burden that complicated every strategic decision, while offering only the remote possibility of financial reward for those who survived to enjoy it. The gold and silver that filled the palace storerooms represented the accumulated wealth of generations, but its weight made mobility impossible, while its presence served as a constant reminder of the greed that had driven Spanish actions and generated Aztec resentment. The strategic situation that confronted Cortés as he planned his evacuation attempt offered no attractive options and few realistic chances of success. The causeway routes that connected the island city to the mainland were heavily fortified and continuously patrolled by Aztec forces, who possessed detailed knowledge of every defensive advantage, while maintaining the ability to coordinate their activities through established communication networks. The lake routes that might have offered alternative escape paths were controlled by war canoes whose crews possessed intimate familiarity with local conditions, while demonstrating consistent superiority in aquatic combat operation. The weather conditions that prevailed on the night selected for the evacuation attempt created both opportunities and additional hazards for Spanish forces. The rain that had been falling intermittently for several days had reduced visibility while muffling sounds that might otherwise have alerted Aztec sentries to Spanish movements. However, the same conditions that provided concealment also made travel more difficult, while creating treacherous footing on stone surfaces that became slippery when wet. The timing of the escape attempt reflected Cortés's understanding that delay would only worsen his position, while offering no realistic prospect of improved circumstances. The siege had already demonstrated Aztec determination to maintain pressure regardless of cost, while the arrival of the rainy season promised to create additional health hazards that would accelerate the deterioration of Spanish capability. The intelligence reports that filtered into the palace suggested that Aztec forces were actually growing stronger as reinforcements arrived from throughout the empire, while Spanish strength continued to decline through attrition. The route selection that determined Spanish movement toward the Western Causeway represented a calculated gamble based on incomplete information about Aztec defensive preparations and the relative strengths of different escape options. The western approach offered the shortest distance to friendly territory while providing access to allies in Tlacopan, who might be able to assist Spanish forces if they managed to reach the mainland. However, this route also led through the most heavily populated portions of the city while requiring passage across several bridge sites that could easily be defended by relatively small numbers of enemy warriors. The organization of the evacuation column reflected both Spanish tactical doctrine and the practical necessities imposed by the desperate nature of their situation. The advance guard consisted of the most experienced soldiers available, while the rear guard included officers who possessed sufficient authority to maintain discipline during what was expected to be a fighting withdrawal under extreme pressure. The civilian refugees, wounded soldiers, and treasure carriers were positioned in the center of the formation where they could receive maximum protection, while remaining close enough to the advance guard to benefit from any breakthrough that might be achieved. The equipment decisions that determined what Spanish forces would carry during their escape attempt required agonizing choices between military necessity and personal survival, practical utility and sentimental value. Weapons and ammunition received priority, but food, water and medical supplies were equally crucial for sustained operations outside the city. The treasure that represented the ultimate objective of the entire enterprise had to be balanced against mobility requirements that might determine whether anyone survived to enjoy the fruits of conquest. The psychological preparation that preceded the evacuation attempt involved efforts to maintain morale among troops who understood that they faced overwhelming odds while participating in an operation that offered little chance of success. Cortés and his officers attempted to inspire confidence through appeals to Spanish honor, Christian faith, and professional pride, while acknowledging the gravity of their situation and the heroic nature of the effort they were about to undertake. The communication protocols that would govern Spanish operations during the evacuation emphasized the importance of maintaining unit cohesion while adapting to circumstances that could not be anticipated in advance. Officers received instructions about rally points, emergency procedures and contingency plans, while understanding that the rapid pace of urban combat would require individual initiative and tactical flexibility that formal military doctrine might not adequately address. The final preparations that occupied the hours before departure included weapon maintenance, equipment distribution, and personal preparations that reflected each individual's understanding that the coming night would likely determine their survival. Prayers were offered in multiple languages, while letters were written to family members who might never learn the fate of their loved ones. Into the darkness, the Spanish evacuation from as the first elements of Cortés's column emerged from Ixtacatl's palace into streets that appeared eerily quiet, despite the knowledge that thousands of enemy warriors waited in concealment throughout the surrounding neighborhood. The silence that greeted their initial movements created false hope that their departure might pass undetected,
but experienced soldiers understood that the Aztecs were simply waiting for the most advantageous moment to spring their carefully prepared trap. The advance guard that led the Spanish formation consisted of 100 picked men under the command of Gonzalo de Sandoval, a young officer whose combination of courage and tactical skill had earned him recognition as one of Cortés's most reliable subordinates. These soldiers carried the portable bridge that would be essential for crossing the gaps where causeway sections had been destroyed, along with the specialized tools and equipment necessary for overcoming defensive obstacles that blocked their route toward the mainland. The treasure convoy that followed the advance guard represented both the greatest prize and the greatest burden of the entire expedition. Hundreds of indigenous porters staggered under loads of gold and silver that had been melted into bars for easier transportation, while Spanish soldiers guarded artifacts and ornaments whose artistic value rivaled their monetary worth. The weight of this wealth slowed the column's progress, while the sound of clinking metal provided auditory cues that could alert enemy forces to Spanish movements despite efforts to maintain silence. The main body of Spanish forces marched in disciplined ranks that reflected years of military experience while maintaining formations that could quickly adapt to combat situations that might develop without warning. Crossbowmen and arquebusiers were positioned to provide covering fire when needed, while pikemen and swordsmen prepared for the close-quarter fighting that was likely to characterize urban combat operations. The wounded and sick were carried on improvised litters that required additional manpower while slowing the pace of movement to speeds that increased exposure to enemy action. The indigenous allies who accompanied the Spanish evacuation faced particularly difficult choices about loyalty and survival that reflected their ambiguous position within the colonial enterprise. The Tlaxcalans, who had provided crucial support throughout the Conquest campaign, understood that their association with European forces made them targets for Aztec vengeance, while their knowledge of local conditions and language capability remained essential for Spanish survival. Their decision to remain with Cortés despite the obvious dangers demonstrated remarkable courage while creating additional burdens for an evacuation operation that was already severely strained by logistical demand. The route that carried Spanish forces through Tenochtitlan's western districts led past architectural monuments and ceremonial spaces that had been the scene of earlier diplomatic triumphs, but now stood as silent witnesses to the collapse of cross-cultural cooperation. The palaces where Spanish officers had been entertained with elaborate feasts were dark and empty, their former inhabitants either dead or in hiding, while their treasures had been looted or destroyed during the months of siege warfare. The first indication that Aztec forces had detected the Spanish evacuation came from the distant sound of conch shell trumpets that echoed across the lake like the voices of awakening demons. These signals were quickly answered by similar calls from other parts of the city, creating a crescendo of communication that suggested coordinated military response was already beginning to mobilize against the fleeing invader. The initial contact between Spanish advance elements and Aztec defenders occurred at the first major intersection where the evacuation route crossed one of the city's primary canals. Warriors emerged from concealed positions behind defensive barriers that had been constructed from the rubble of demolished buildings, while war canoes moved into position to attack the causeway from both sides. The fighting that erupted combined the desperation of Spanish escape attempts with the fury of Aztec defenders who understood that this might be their last opportunity to destroy the foreign invaders who had brought such devastation to their civilization. The portable bridge that was essential for Spanish progress across the destroyed causeway sections proved both blessing and curse as the evacuation proceeded through increasingly hostile territory. While the bridge enabled the column to maintain forward movement across gaps that would otherwise have been impassable, its weight and bulk made rapid deployment difficult, while its necessity for continued progress made it a target that Aztec forces concentrated their efforts to destroy or capture. The tactical decisions that Cortés faced as his column encountered increasing resistance required balancing the competing demands of speed and security, treasure preservation and personnel survival. The narrow causeways that provided the only escape routes created choke points where relatively small numbers of defenders could inflict massive casualties on attacking forces, while the weight of Spanish equipment and treasure limited mobility options and escape possibility. The weather conditions that had initially favored Spanish concealment began to work against them as the rain intensified and lightning flashes illuminated their movements for enemy observation. The stone surfaces of the causeway became treacherously slippery, while visibility decreased to distances that made coordination difficult and surprise attacks more likely to succeed. The Causeway of Sorrows, The western causeway that served as the primary escape route for Spanish forces stretched across Lake Texcoco like a stone bridge between two worlds. The dying hopes of European conquest behind and the uncertain prospects of indigenous sanctuary. This narrow pathway, barely wide enough for two mounted men to ride abreast, had been constructed by Aztec engineers as a marvel of hydraulic architecture that connected the island capital to the mainland, while providing control points that could regulate traffic and defend against invasion. Now in the pre-dawn darkness of July 1st, 1520, this same causeway had become a killing ground where the accumulated grievances of 8 months of foreign occupation would be settled in blood and water. The Aztec defenders, who controlled every bridge gap, every defensive position, and every approach route, understood that they faced their greatest opportunity to eliminate the European threat that had brought such devastation to their civilization.
The destruction of bridge sections that spanned the deepest parts of the lake channel had created gaps that could be crossed only by swimming or by using the portable bridge that Spanish forces carried with them as their most precious piece of equipment. The first of these obstacles appeared less than half a kilometer from the city's edge, where the causeway crossed a channel that separated the main island from a smaller landmass that served as an outer defensive perimeter. The deployment of the Spanish bridge under combat conditions revealed the tactical nightmare that Cortés had hoped to avoid, but always understood might be necessary for survival. The heavy timbers that formed the bridge's structure required dozens of men to position and secure, creating a stationary target that attracted concentrated enemy fire, while exposing Spanish forces to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The war canoes that emerged from the darkness on both sides of the causeway carried veteran warriors whose combat skills had been honed through years of territorial expansion and flower wars that had established Aztec dominance throughout central Mexico. These men possessed intimate knowledge of lake conditions and combat techniques that gave them enormous advantages over European forces, whose military training had emphasized land warfare rather than amphibious operations. The assault that erupted as Spanish forces attempted to cross the first bridge gap demonstrated the carefully coordinated nature of Aztec resistance and the sophisticated tactical planning that had prepared for this exact situation. Warriors in canoes attacked from the water, while archers positioned on both sides of the causeway created crossfire zones that made Spanish movement extremely hazardous. Simultaneously, forces that had been concealed behind defensive barriers on the causeway itself launched frontal assaults that threatened to overwhelm the Spanish formation through sheer weight of numbers. The close-quarter fighting that developed as Aztec warriors boarded the causeway and engaged Spanish forces in hand-to-hand combat revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of European military technology under extreme stress conditions. Spanish steel weapons proved superior to obsidian blades in direct confrontation, but the narrow confines of the causeway prevented effective use of cavalry, while limiting opportunities for tactical maneuvering that might have exploited European advantages. The treasure convoy that had been positioned in the center of the Spanish formation became a devastating liability as the evacuation degenerated into a running battle. The weight of gold and silver that had motivated Spanish participation in the conquest enterprise now threatened to drag its carriers to the bottom of the lake, while the time required to protect and transport these valuable loads compromised tactical mobility and combat effectiveness. The indigenous allies who had accompanied Spanish forces throughout the conquest campaign faced particular dangers as they became targets for Aztec vengeance, while struggling to maintain their association with European forces, whose protection they desperately needed for survival. The Tlaxcalan warriors who had provided crucial support during the siege of Tenochtitlan now found themselves fighting for their lives against enemies who regarded them as traitors, deserving of special punishment. The breakdown of unit cohesion that occurred as Spanish forces encountered increasing resistance created panic conditions that transformed organized military retreat into chaotic flight. Officers lost contact with their units, while individual soldiers made desperate decisions about whether to abandon equipment, treasure,
or wounded comrades in order to improve their own chances of survival. The second bridge gap that blocked Spanish progress appeared at the causeway's halfway point, where the deepest part of the channel created a barrier that could only be crossed by swimming or by deploying their portable bridge, under conditions that were even more dangerous than those encountered at the first obstacle. By this time, Aztec resistance had intensified to levels that made organized military operations virtually impossible, while casualties had reduced Spanish fighting strength to a fraction of its original capability. The disaster that unfolded at this second crossing point would be remembered as the climactic moment of La Nocte, when Spanish dreams of easy conquest collided with Aztec determination to defend their homeland regardless of cost. The portable bridge that had enabled Spanish forces to maintain forward movement became trapped under the weight of men and equipment, creating an immovable obstacle that blocked the causeway, while exposing everyone in the vicinity to concentrated enemy fire. The fighting that raged around the trapped bridge lasted for hours as Spanish forces made desperate attempts to free their essential equipment, while Aztec warriors pressed attacks from every direction. The narrow confines of the causeway created conditions where individual heroism and small unit tactics determined survival more than overall strategic planning or technological advantage. The weight of gold, the treasure that had motivated Spanish participation in the conquest of Mexico, became the instrument of their destruction, as soldiers and porters weighted down with gold and silver found themselves unable to swim when thrown into Lake Texcoco's cold water. The irony was bitter and complete. The wealth that had driven men across an ocean and inspired them to attempt impossible conquests now dragged them down into dark depths, where all dreams of riches ended in drowning silence. The systematic looting that had occupied Spanish forces throughout their 8-month occupation of Tenochtitlan had accumulated wealth beyond the wildest dreams of European adventurer. Gold artifacts that represented centuries of Aztec artistic achievement had been melted down into portable bars, while silver ornaments and jade decorations had been stripped from temples and palaces without regard for their cultural significance or artistic value. The Spanish obsession with precious metals had transformed priceless works of art into anonymous lumps of material whose only value lay in their weight and purity. The distribution of this treasure among Spanish forces had followed military protocols that allocated shares according to rank and investment, while ensuring that every participant received compensation proportional to their contributions to the enterprise. Cortés himself claimed the largest portion as expedition commander, while his officers received amounts that reflected their leadership responsibilities. Ordinary soldiers were guaranteed shares that represented more wealth than most European peasants could accumulate in lifetimes of labor. But the very abundance of this treasure created logistical nightmares that complicated every aspect of the evacuation operation. The weight of precious metals that could be carried by individual soldiers or porters was limited by human physical capabilities, while the volume of accumulated wealth exceeded transportation capacity by enormous margins. Difficult choices had to be made about which items to carry and which to abandon, decisions that would determine not only financial outcomes, but survival prospects for everyone involved. The psychological impact of abandoning treasure that represented years of risk and sacrifice created additional stress for soldiers who faced the ultimate test of choosing between wealth and life. Many had invested their entire personal resources in the expedition, while borrowing heavily to finance their participation. The prospect of returning to Spain empty-handed after surviving the dangers of conquest seemed almost as terrible as dying in Mexico with pockets full of gold. The tactical complications created by treasure transportation became apparent as soon as the evacuation began, when the weight of precious metals slowed movement, while the sound of clinking metal alerted Aztec forces to Spanish position. The porters who carried the heaviest loads required assistance over difficult terrain, while becoming priority targets for enemy forces who understood that capturing Spanish treasure would eliminate European motivation for continued operation. The moral dilemmas that confronted Spanish officers as casualties mounted included decisions about whether wounded soldiers should retain their treasure shares or transfer them to able-bodied men who might have better chances of reaching safety. These choices involved competing obligations to individual welfare and collective survival that military training had not prepared leaders to resolve under extreme stress conditions. The equipment decisions that determined what soldiers would carry during combat operations required balancing treasure preservation against military effectiveness, personal survival against financial objectives. Weapons and ammunition were essential for fighting capability, but precious metals represented the ultimate purpose of the entire enterprise. Food and water were necessary for sustained operations, but their weight reduced capacity for treasure transportation. The scene at the second bridge gap, where Spanish forces became trapped while attempting to free their portable bridge, provided the climactic demonstration of how treasure became a liability under combat conditions. Soldiers weighed down with gold and silver found themselves unable to maneuver effectively, while those who abandoned their wealth gained mobility advantages that might save their lives. The drowning victims who disappeared into Lake Texcoco's depths carried with them not only their own lives, but also their portions of the treasure that had motivated the entire expedition. The lake bottom became a repository for Spanish dreams and Aztec gold, an underwater graveyard where conquistadors' ambitions rested alongside the artistic achievements of destroyed civilization. The survivors who reached the western shore of the lake carried bitter lessons about the relationship between wealth and survival, the difference between portable and practical assets, the costs of greed when measured against human life. Their experiences would influence Spanish colonial policies for generations, while providing cautionary tales about the dangers of prioritizing material gain over strategic wisdom. The indigenous perspective on Spanish treasure obsession revealed fundamental differences between European and Mesoamerican concepts of wealth and value. The Aztecs, who witnessed Spanish soldiers drowning under the weight of gold, understood that their enemies had been destroyed by the very greed that had motivated their invasion. The precious metals that Europeans valued so highly held different meanings for indigenous peoples who appreciated artistic craftsmanship and religious significance more than raw material value. The immediate aftermath of La Noche Triste left most Spanish treasure at the bottom of Lake Texcoco, where it would remain for centuries as archaeological evidence of the night when European conquest ambitions nearly drowned in their own exodus. The wealth that survived the evacuation was minimal compared to original accumulations, creating financial disaster for investors who had expected enormous returns on their American adventure. The survivors' dawn. As the first light of dawn broke across Lake Texcoco on July 1st, 1520, the bedraggled survivors of the Spanish evacuation from Tenochtitlan, of the nearly 1,300 Spanish soldiers and 6,000 indigenous allies who had attempted the crossing, fewer than 400 Europeans and perhaps 1,000 native warriors had survived the night of horror that would forever be remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrow. Hernán Cortés himself presented a figure that bore little resemblance to the confident conquistador who had once dreamed of ruling an empire. His armor was dented and blood-stained, his sword nicked from countless encounters with obsidian weapons, and his face bore the hollow expression of a man who had witnessed the destruction of a he had worked to. The tears that witnesses claimed to have seen streaming down his cheeks as he sat beneath an ahuehuete tree were not merely expressions of personal grief, but acknowledgments of a catastrophic failure that had cost hundreds of lives while destroying Spanish credibility throughout Mesoamerica.
The physical condition of the survivors reflected the trauma of their escape, while providing graphic testimony to the intensity of Aztec resistance. Wounded men bore injuries from obsidian blades, wooden clubs, and stones hurled with deadly accuracy by defenders who had fought with the desperation of people defending their homes against foreign invaders. The lucky ones had suffered only cuts and bruises, while others displayed wounds that would require weeks of recovery if infection did not prove fatal. The psychological impact of the defeat extended far beyond immediate physical casualties to encompass the complete destruction of Spanish military prestige and the myths of European invincibility that had facilitated their earlier conquests. The indigenous allies who had survived the retreat understood that association with Spanish forces no longer provided protection, but had become a liability that marked them as targets for Aztec vengeance. The loss of equipment that accompanied the evacuation disaster eliminated most Spanish technological advantages, while leaving survivors dependent upon whatever weapons and supplies they could carry during their flight. The cannons that had provided decisive firepower during earlier engagements lay at the bottom of Lake Texcoco, along with crossbows, harquebuses, and ammunition that could not be replaced from local resources. The destruction of the horse herd represented another catastrophic blow to Spanish military capabilities, as these animals had provided not only tactical advantages, but also psychological weapons that exploited indigenous unfamiliarity with mounted warfare. Of the hundreds of horses that had accompanied Spanish forces into Tenochtitlan, fewer than 24 survived the causeway fighting, leaving Cortés with insufficient cavalry for effective military operations. The financial devastation that resulted from the loss of treasure created additional complications for Spanish survivors who had invested their personal resources in the expedition while expecting enormous returns on their American adventures. The gold and silver that now rested on the lake bottom represented not only lost profits, but also debts that would have to be repaid from other sources. The strategic situation that confronted Spanish survivors offered few attractive options for continued operations against an enemy that had demonstrated superior numbers, local knowledge, and fighting capabilities in familiar terrain. The alliance network that had enabled European success during the initial phases of conquest had been severely damaged by the Tenochtitlan disaster, while Aztec confidence had been enormously enhanced by their victory over supposedly invincible invaders. The intelligence reports that reached Cortés during his first days on the mainland brought additional bad news about the regional situation and the prospects for continued Spanish operations. Aztec forces throughout central Mexico had been emboldened by news of the Tenochtitlan victory, while indigenous communities that had previously submitted to Spanish authority were reconsidering their positions and exploring opportunities for rebellion. The leadership challenges that faced Cortés and his officers included maintaining discipline among demoralized troops, while developing strategies for survival that seemed to offer little hope of ultimate success. The officer corps that had once competed for advancement opportunities now focused on basic survival while questioning whether continued resistance served any useful purpose. The medical crisis that developed among Spanish survivors reflected both combat injuries and the diseases that flourished under conditions of stress, malnutrition, and poor sanitation that characterized their refugee status. Without adequate medical supplies or trained personnel, even minor wounds could become life-threatening infections, while diseases like dysentery and typhus spread rapidly through camps where basic hygiene was impossible to maintain. The morale problems that plagued Spanish forces after La Noche Triste included not only grief for fallen comrades, but also fundamental questions about the wisdom and feasibility of continuing operations against an enemy that had proven capable of inflicting devastating defeats. Many soldiers expressed desires to abandon the conquest attempt entirely while seeking passage back to Spain or other Spanish territories where their survival prospects seemed more favorable. The communication challenges that prevented effective coordination between Spanish survivors and their potential allies reflected both the destruction of established networks and the damage to Spanish credibility that resulted from their dramatic defeat. Indigenous leaders who had previously been willing to risk association with European forces now calculated that Spanish protection was worth less than Aztec displeasure. Yet even in defeat, Cortés retained the strategic vision and tactical brilliance that had enabled his initial successes, while beginning to develop plans for recovery that would ultimately lead to Aztec destruction. The night that had almost destroyed Spanish ambitions in Mexico would become instead the crucible that forged new strategies and alliances capable of overthrowing the most powerful empire in the America. The Phoenix Rising. The 6 months that followed La Noche Triste witnessed one of the most remarkable recoveries in military history, as Hernán Cortés transformed a devastating defeat into the foundation for ultimate victory through strategic brilliance, diplomatic innovation, and relentless determination that refused to accept failure as permanent. The seeds of Aztec destruction were sown not in the moment of Spanish triumph, but in the aftermath of their greatest disaster, when desperate circumstances forced European leaders to develop new approaches that would prove more effective than their original strategy. The immediate priority that faced Spanish survivors was reaching safe territory where they could recover from their wounds, while regrouping for whatever actions might be possible in the future. The march to Tlaxcala, their most reliable indigenous ally, required crossing hostile territory where every village and city-state had received news of Spanish defeat, while being encouraged by Aztec emissaries to attack the fleeing invader. The diplomatic revolution that Cortés initiated during this period of weakness
demonstrated his understanding that military force alone could never conquer an empire as vast and sophisticated as the Aztec Confederation. Instead of relying primarily upon European technological advantages, Spanish strategy began emphasizing indigenous political divisions and regional grievances that could be exploited through careful alliance building and psychological warfare. The smallpox epidemic that swept through central Mexico during 1520 and 15, the disease that killed millions of native peoples, affected Europeans minimally due to previous exposure, creating dramatic shifts in relative population that altered the fundamental balance of power throughout Mesoamerica. The reconstruction of Spanish military capabilities that occurred during their refuge in Tlaxcala involved not only recruiting new personnel and acquiring replacement equipment, but also developing new tactical doctrines that incorporated lessons learned from the Tenochtitlan disaster. The siege warfare techniques that would prove decisive during the final assault on the Aztec capital were developed during this period of recovery and planning. The shipbuilding project that enabled Spanish control of Lake Texcoco represented a masterpiece of military engineering that combined European technical knowledge with indigenous labor and materials to create naval capabilities that the Aztecs could not match. The brigantines that dominated the lake during the final siege eliminated Aztec advantages in aquatic warfare, while providing Spanish forces with mobility and logistics support that proved crucial for victory. The intelligence operations that provided detailed information about Aztec military preparations and political developments relied upon networks of indigenous allies and Spanish agents, who gathered information while spreading propaganda that undermined enemy morale and encouraged defection. These activities created psychological advantages that complemented military operations, while reducing the costs and risks associated with purely military solutions. The alliance expansion that brought thousands of additional indigenous warriors into the Spanish camp reflected both Cortés's diplomatic skills and Aztec political failures that alienated potential supporters, while creating opportunities for European exploitation. The tribute system that had sustained Aztec power became a source of weakness when presented with alternatives that promised liberation from imperial obligation. The technological integration that combined European weapons with indigenous knowledge created military capabilities that neither culture could have achieved independently. Spanish firearms and steel weapons provided decisive advantages in direct combat, while native guides, interpreters, and logistical support enabled operations in terrain where Europeans could not have functioned effectively alone. The final siege of Tenochtitlan that began in May 1521 represented the culmination of strategic planning that had begun during the darkest moments following La Noche. The systematic destruction of causeways, aqueducts, and chinampas that supported the city created starvation conditions that accomplished what direct assault could never have achieved against defenders who were willing to fight to the death. The capture of Cuauhtémoc on August 13, 1521 marked not only the end of Aztec political independence, but also the completion of Cortés's transformation from a defeated refugee into the conqueror of the largest indigenous empire in the Americas. The emperor's surrender validated strategies that had been developed during the months of recovery following Spanish humiliation during La Noche. The historical irony of Spanish success emerging from the ashes of apparent failure demonstrates that military history's most significant victories often result not from initial advantages, but from the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances while learning from temporary defeat. La Noche Triste, which should have ended Spanish ambitions in Mexico, instead taught lessons that made ultimate conquest inevitable. The legacy of the night that almost destroyed Spanish Mexico serves as a reminder that in warfare, as in other human endeavors, final outcomes are determined not by individual battles, but by the wisdom to learn from setbacks while maintaining commitment to ultimate objectives. The tears that Cortés shed beneath the ahuehuete tree watered the roots of strategies that would reshape the history of two continents, while establishing European colonial dominance that would endure for centuries. From the depths of Lake Texcoco, where Spanish treasure rested alongside Aztec dreams, to the heights of imperial triumph that would follow within a year, La Noche Triste represents both the vulnerability of conquest ambitions and the resilience of human determination when guided by strategic vision and tactical innovation. In understanding this night of sorrows, we glimpse the complex forces that shape the collision between worlds and the ultimate emergence of new civilizations from the ashes of the old.